Great. Thanks very much. So I'm obviously going to pick up on some of the themes from the previous presentation because it's obviously very relevant, the water security and climate change risk. So in the short time we've got, I'll hopefully sketch out a little bit of some of the science, a bit of thoughts, some lessons learned, and hopefully certainly plenty of risks, but maybe some opportunities that will come up, and I'm sure be picked up on some other topics. So essentially we know that obviously water is life and it's critical, but it also can be death and destruction as well, as we found recently. It's certainly important, critical, not only for life, but also to the economy, but also to the environment. And what we're learning increasingly, and it came up in this conversation, is the connectedness between the economy and the environment and human societies as well. And that's meant that it's actually become one of the top global risks globally, and certainly in the South African context. Whether it's direct impact or water often becomes a theme in several other, if you look at the top 5 global risks, 3 or 4 of them all have a water-related feature. Whether it's extreme events, it's climate change, it's water security, they all have a water kind of theme to it. And it's really sort of critical in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a core again to that, and also some of the measures we put in place to ensure water security are critical in helping us meet some of the Sustainable Development Goals. And here in the Western Cape, we know all about the Growth for Jobs plan, and it's a key to the sort of economic plan and growth within the Western Cape. Probably is one of the most water-sensitive kind of provinces, but also maybe one of the most water-aware kind of provinces. We've certainly come through our lessons learned, and that's a lot of that is filtered through into sort of planning both at provincial but also national level and local and microclimate level, as we just heard. So it's absolutely critical to where we are. So they did a World Bank study fairly recently, kind of looking at the hydro economy of the Western Cape. And one of the things was to look at the impact of the recent drought. And the impact they worked out is about sort of between 15 and 23 billion rand, sort of if you accumulate everything, all the water shortages as a result of that sort of 15 to 2017 drought. And obviously agriculture was one of the highest impacted sectors, and many of you I'm sure are familiar with that. But other areas that are typically often considered water secure or less directly impacted on water, because they sort of assume that the water will come out of the taps. That's kind of been our assumption. Manufacturing sector, construction and other sector. One interesting added factor, certainly in the latest drought, was the impact on tourism. And that came through one of the emerging lessons we have in water security, and it's really strong with the theme of the seminar at the moment, is it's not only the physical presence of a challenge, but the messaging and the communication and the information that means and how it is communicated that comes through. And so a lot of the impact in the tourism sector was the way and the communication around a risk and a challenge, and so how you manage that message, and then as a result, how everybody has to come together and realize this is everybody's challenge, and that's how we have to get through it. And that's very much how we talked about how we got through the water crisis. Well, a lot of that was essentially about all coming together. Maybe a little bit late in some respects, but that was essentially the key message. And one of the things they looked at, and this just sort of shows some of the figures out of it, they looked at what would be the economic impact of not augmenting, in this case, the Western Cape water supply system, which is the main supply system to City of Cape Town and large areas in the Berg and the Breda area. It's probably about 80% of the economy of the Western Cape kind of is supported through that system. It probably uses about 50% of the water. The other 50% is through the rest of the province. But basically they said if you don't augment, if you don't meet these food shortages, you're going to lose about 7% of the economy kind of thing going on. So augmentation, a 7% increase in the GDP plus almost 200,000 extra jobs, kind of that's the price of doing nothing. Essentially, if we don't respond and actually augment and address our water security challenges into the future. An interesting added on study of it was, if you look at the way that integrated systems, and in South Africa, we're a dry country, we've been evolving for hundreds of years. I mean, we very quickly ran out of water at the foot of Table Mountain before we had to look for other sources. Our systems have become more and more complex, but with fewer and fewer readily available sources. The Berg River Dam was probably the last major large dam we have in the area. So as we get, the options become more and more expensive as we go forward. And so we have to kind of meet that marginal benefits, but they also become different, they become more integrated. And one of the questions, particularly when you look at something like the Western Cape system, is the interaction between urban and agricultural users. It serves both services, but increasingly alternative sources such as desalination, reuse, which are the major future water supply systems, aren't necessarily available to all users in the system. So how can you start to run a system in a more integrated way, kind of thing? So can you say, well, it's not just surface water, but actually we're having, the city of Cape Town generating water, can it benefit the broader system or just on its own? The same is true in smaller systems where we start to think we can either look after our own independent challenges or we can look, hang on, we're all part of this integrated system. And in this case, it's physically connected through the integrated system, but it's also economically connected. And that was what this study was trying to say, was there's a physical connection through the water supply system, but there's also an economic connection. So the water security provided through, for example, the Western Cape system boosts the regional economy, which then in turn also boosts, for example, the city of Cape Town or other associated benefits. So we have this second order of connection, which is why looking at water security and water resilience becomes more than just a physical kind of challenge. And so what we were trying to show there was say there are, in addition just to the pure benefits from augmentation, there's additional economic added benefits from being more integrated and thinking more holistically in system and actually, looking after each other and managing each other's sort of, how can we optimize everybody's risk together in this space? So that was one of the other things. The other interesting thing was when they looked at the benefits, economic benefits through the economy. So on the right-hand side is different economic brackets of deciles of households. Typically, everybody benefits, because the economy is growing. But what they found was obviously the poorer households benefited the less because they were not connected into the economic system that's benefiting directly from the system. So again, there was a little bit of an inequality in who benefits. So the argument being here, you needed an augmented system, but you also needed to put in other structural measures to address equity and sustainability through that aspect. And then again, this combination of, if you're not, you can just provide the economy, the augmentation to fix the economy, but if you're not addressing the social aspects of it, then we're also not addressing the problem and we're going to lead to increased risk further down. So there are many other risks. We talked about kind of increasing water requirements and demands, deteriorating water quality, huge challenge we know. Certainly rivers like the Berg and the Breda River, huge challenges around water quality, increasingly becoming more of a risk through failing infrastructure, which is also one of the challenges there. Urban planning, the challenge around urban planning, and particularly here where in many cases we use our rivers as conveyance systems for our water. So often we're taking good quality water, putting it to a river to transfer it somewhere else, where it maybe starts getting impacted by poor urban development or lack of infrastructure along the route. So we have it becoming a water security challenge through a water quality and an urban planning and social challenges. So we do have limited additional surface water supplies. We're having to go to alternative options. Those are typically more expensive, they're more energy intensive, so they have other added benefits. But how can we bring those additional water supply systems into this more integrated system? Aging infrastructure, we talked about it. Institutional governance capacity, one of the great challenges, and that was certainly a lesson learned through the Western Cape, the drought crisis, and increasingly through others, Gauteng's water supply, Nelson Mandela's water challenges, that integration and challenges around organizational capacity at government and institutional level, and the role of all role players in being part of that solution. Environmental degradation, we've certainly seen, we've known for a long time the benefits of clearing invasive alien plants and how that has if we don't manage the growth of invasive trees in our catchments, it certainly reduces our water availability impacts. But also what we're finding through certainly flood events is the benefits of natural attenuation through wetlands, riparian areas, those sort of stuff. If we lose that environmental degradation, it just increases the risk of flooding, of droughts and disasters. So we're learning that need, and as those environmental systems become more degraded, our human risk goes up and increases as we see these more increased climate-related impacts. Invasive alien plants, certainly we know, and unfortunately we're not winning the battle on the spread of invasive alien plants. There's some argument that increasing climate is actually furthering the rate of spread and growth, and we're just not putting enough investment in managing it. And that also has, we know of all the other biodiversity benefits, the social, economic benefits as a job creation, all those other co-benefits we come up with. A challenge that's essentially a water security problem, but it becomes a broader resilience opportunity. We're seeing migration. What we're seeing is, particularly in the Western Cape, we're seeing huge inter-rural migration in some areas where water scarcity doesn't become a problem so much because there are fewer people there living in the area, whereas in other areas, you may even have plenty of water now, you think so, but as your increased migration rates increase, then it becomes a challenge in the future, even if you may be in a part of the country that's going to get wetter in the future, and there are a few of those. Urban planning challenges and increasing flood damage, we've seen the risk, and increasingly the risk to critical infrastructure. So if we're losing major pipelines or conveyance systems, our systems are often very sensitive to those kind of impacts. And how do we mitigate the flood damage that can create a water security kind of risk? Disease outbreaks and epidemics, and increasingly we've seen increasing energy costs and load shedding, which is having a huge challenge. Particularly, we're relatively fortunate in the Western Cape, although it is a challenge. But major areas, you think of Gauteng, we basically have to pump all the water up. It's sitting on a continental divide. It's probably the worst place you want to build a major economy. But we have to provide a reliable energy supply to get our reliable water security. We can have all the water from Lesotho, but if we can't get it into our systems, then we have a major challenge. So there's certainly many lessons we can learn. So obviously the Cape Town Day Zero crisis, Nelson Mandela Bay water crisis, and that was certainly on the global news. And in the Cape Town crisis, I was actually in Australia fairly soon afterwards. They were going through a very similar crisis. They had their big millennial drought, which we had learned from, and now they were learning from our Day Zero. And so they found, and even in New Zealand, you think a country that has plenty of water, they had a major crisis because they had no rain for 3 months. So I said, well, we've had no rain for 3 years, so maybe we can kind of share some notes. Ironically, the amount of rain they got on their dams, on average, is exactly the same as what we get on the dams above Cape Town. They just get it nice and smoothly, typically, so they're used to constant supply. We have used to this high variability of climate. And so we've actually built many resilient systems to deal with this natural variability that they're actually starting to look to. And London is the same challenge. They're looking to countries like South Africa that have dealt with highly variable climates, whether it's rainfall or flooding, and they say, well, how have you built that? How have you managed to do that? And they say, well, we built resilient systems. Our systems are integrated. We manage the risks. We might have to have restrictions in, that's all part of our management systems. So how do they have to start, oh, well, maybe we have to start thinking of doing something similar. And one of the big lessons that came out of the Cape Town crisis was communication and engaging everybody and getting everybody from the household users to the farmers, to the industry, to government, to all come together and say, actually, we're all in this together. How do we manage our risks together collectively? And that's essentially what got us through there. And in some cases, being able to donate water when there were crises. We certainly know that climate change, we can't attribute a single event to climate change. So both the drought and the floods, both in KZN and more recently in the Western Cape, we can't attribute them to climate change, but we do know that the likelihood of these events is probably going to become greater in the future. Because essentially, we're putting more heat into a system that's getting faster and faster. So you can imagine you're driving the system quicker, we're going to have these more extreme events, kind of both heat and temperature and drought, as well as floods as we go through. And increasingly, if you look globally, and Africa particularly, the latest results from the International Panel for Climate Change started to say certainly Africa is having the greater impacts of climate than had previously been thought, and increasingly greater concern around flooding, much more extreme events, and that's particularly in sort of Central, East, and West Africa. We've seen what's happened in Kenya. We're seeing increased events of cyclones and storms hitting our neighbors in Malawi, Zambia, and even in South Africa, certainly the Eastern Cape, Gauteng areas where climate models are saying more likely intense events is the future. Even here in the Western Cape, though, we are starting to see it. So there's this concern, and a flood is much more immediate impact. A drought, in many ways, we can manage it up to a certain extent. In a flood, we can put things in place, but we also have to be prepared for it. And how do we recover? The example of the road, I think, was a fantastic example to do that, as was the example of how we respond in a crisis. Having that emergency plan to say, resilience is not just about preventing a damage, but how quickly we recover. And in Cape Town, the lessons learned from the drought crisis, they've said many of those lessons helped them to deal with the COVID crisis. So how do you identify vulnerable communities? How do you mobilize information and data to manage your risk? So the city itself has said, we learned a lot of lessons that have now helped us with other challenges and epidemics. How can we take that going forward? One of the probable downsides is we've adapted in many ways to people become much more efficient in the way we use our water. The question is now, have we squeezed all the fat out of the system? So when we come the next drought, how are we going to quickly be able to reduce consumption by 10% or 15%, 20%? Do we still have those mechanisms in place when the next drought comes? Because we are going to have to manage demand as part of the crisis. So part of that water balance planning is to say, what's my average year, but what would I do in a crisis? If I had to restrict my water use, how would I get through a year, 2 years, what is my plan to do that? Because that is the way we manage water, particularly as the alternative to provide 100% security, the cost goes up quite significantly, probably about 10 times. Certainly the challenge of failing water supply infrastructure and sanitation. So typically when we talked about water security, we'd talk about rainfall, runoff, dams, all that stuff. Typically now, and we'd talk water quality would be a separate issue. The two are becoming interconnected, and declining water quality certainly direct human health impact, but also an economy. What we also saw in the drought crisis was if you have lower flows, any water quality problems there's less dilution in the system, so it becomes even greater of a risk. But as I said, the challenge around the water quality increases your drought risks as well. And how it's also impacting on our ecological systems as well. So those systems that are there to help manage our water security are now being impacted by our poor ecological management. A study that was done by DBSA, they looked at clothing and sustainable development goals. The gap on the sustainable development goals reckoned that there's about a 91 billion rand gap in what we need to provide sustainable water and sanitation infrastructure by 2030 to meet it. And that's after accounting for all the money that's already in the system that should be there allocated to infrastructure through tariffs, provincial allocations and stuff like that. So the question is, how do we close that gap? And that's where a lot of the conversation starts having about public-private partnerships and relationships to start closing the gap. And there are various measures you can think of to do it, but it's a huge gap. And the bottom measure says the same. If you talk about water risk, we talked a little bit about physical risk, but we also talk about institutional risk, and increasingly we're talking about reputational risk. So even if you have a functioning economy or functioning farm or a town that's able to manage its own water, but if the neighboring community doesn't have water or sanitation, it becomes a reputational risk on yourself. So your water risk becomes more than just the physical risk. So how do we all come together to manage those increasing risks? So as many of you will see the climate change scenarios. I won't go into them a lot of detail, but essentially here in the Western Cape, which is the one in the middle here, the future is pretty bleak on average, generally drying. Some of the other regions are maybe less so, but these plumes show the wide range of uncertainty. So there's no such thing. We're not going to be able to predict the future, but we do know it's likely to get more dry, or at least more intense and more varied. Some areas might be slightly different. How do we manage that? You can see how it varies spatially. What we've shown is that even if there's this variation across the country, we often manage our systems through these integrated systems, and so we move water around the country quite well, very efficiently. We've been doing it for hundreds of years. Typically, they say water doesn't flow downhill anymore, it flows towards money, so most of our water goes to Gauteng, kind of thing. But that system becomes really critical. So this is a very complicated slide, but the left shows a probability distribution of impact on runoff. If we turn it to water supply, the range narrows quite significantly, the risk, because we can manage our systems, because we can move water around, we can put it in storage, we can alternate different water supply sources. So those integrated systems become absolutely critical, and it also reflects on this study looked at the economic impacts nationally. And we see that if we manage the system, the water impact can be quite a lot less, purely on a water supply. But the impact on roads, which is the damage to our infrastructure, becomes a significant impact. And obviously the direct impact on agriculture generally is probably the one that's greatest economic impact nationally as a result of climate change. This talks, so many of you have seen, this is the talk about the Western Cape water supply system. So what is happening, the Department of Water Sanitation is currently updating it, looking at all future water supply options. And basically, this is where our system sits now. We expect the system available water yield to decline over time, as a result of climate change, but also increasing spread of invasive alien plants if we don't do something about it. So we need to clear those. That's the first grey. Then all the other options, how do we meet the growing demand, which is the curve here? This shows how we've come back from the drought. We're pretty much back to about 80% of where we were. So people have either become more efficient or become more efficient and then using more water again. But now we have to stack these options. And as I said, these all start to become very expensive and harder to manage and more integrated. So the systems we're going to run in the future are going to be much more complicated. And that's at a regional level and at a national level as well. This is the impact of invasive alien plants. It can cause up to about 16% loss in our water, equivalent of our water supply loss, if we don't manage our invasive alien plants nationally, and up to about 30% in catchments like the Breda River catchment. Some of you will know of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, which is an interesting innovation around how we clear invasive alien plants through a public-private partnership relationship. So getting water users to invest in catchments to protect their own water security, and it's done around the world. I'll get into my last slide. So essentially, one of the themes is continuing investments in the planning, operation, and maintenance of our water and sanitation infrastructure, as well as protection of ecological infrastructure, is critical in ensuring for the water security in South Africa, particularly here in the Western Cape, and certainly in the agriculture and the horticulture industry as well. Thank you very much.